My name is Elias, and for the last few years, I've been obsessed with vanishing places. I grew up reading about the Angakuni Lake incident, where 30 people just blinked out of existence. I spent nights researching Kuldara, trying to figure out how 1,500 people could vanish. To most, these are just creepy stories, but to me, they felt like breadcrumbs to a truth. I always believed that if I looked hard enough, I'd find the seam where our world ends. It started as a routine trip through a remote, densely forested region in the Appalachian Mountains. I had my gear, my car, and a GPS that I trusted more than I should have. People always tell you to stay on the main roads, but my curiosity is a dangerous thing. I was looking for a specific historical site, something documented but largely forgotten by time. The fog was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was dense, heavy, and smelled like ozone. I crawled along at 5 miles per hour, my headlights barely cutting through the swirling white mass. Then, as if a curtain had been pulled back, the mist cleared into a small valley. Nestled there was a town that looked like a postcard from the middle of the last century. The sign at the entrance read Oakhaven, but the paint was so fresh it looked wet. The houses were pristine, with white picket fences and manicured lawns that seemed too perfect. Street lamps glowed with a soft, warm amber light that didn't flicker or buzz like modern LEDs. There were no power lines overhead, no satellite dishes, and no signs of the modern world. I pulled over to the side of the main street, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was beautiful, but there was a profound sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite place. Every window was lit, casting long, inviting shadows across the empty sidewalks and quiet porches. I stepped out of my car, and the first thing I noticed was the absolute lack of noise. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, and not a single insect chirping in the grass. The air was unnervingly still, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for me. I stood by my open car door, staring down the length of the perfectly empty main street. I called out a hello, but my voice didn't echo. It just died in the heavy air. I decided to walk toward the center of town, hoping to find a resident or a sheriff. I passed a hardware store with a display of shiny red lawnmowers that looked brand new. In the window of a toy shop, porcelain dolls stared out at me with glassy, vacant eyes. Everything was immaculate, but the lack of people was starting to make my skin crawl. I reached a small diner called the Silver Spoon, its neon sign humming a low, steady tone. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread drifted out through the propped open front door. It was the most normal thing I'd encountered so far, yet it felt like a trap. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand resting on the cold metal handle of the screen door. "Is anyone in here?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the oppressive silence. There was no answer, only the faint rhythmic ticking of a large clock somewhere in the back. That's when I saw the first sign that people had been here only seconds before I entered. On the third booth from the door, a plate of eggs and bacon sat steaming on the table. A fork was resting against the side of the plate as if someone had just set it down. Next to the cup was a cup of coffee, the dark liquid still swirling from a recent stir. Further down the counter, a cigarette sat in a glass ashtray, a thin trail of smoke rising. It was burning steadily, the ash long but not yet fallen, indicating it was recently lit. I reached out and touched the side of the coffee cup. It was piping hot, almost burning. "Hello?" I shouted, louder this time, my panic beginning to rise like a cold tide. I ran to the kitchen door and pushed it open, expecting to see a cook or a waitress. The grills were hot, a pot of soup was simmering on the stove, but the kitchen was empty. Back in the dining area, a radio began to play a low, distorted tune from a local station. It was a song I didn't recognize, something slow and melodic with a heavy, warping pitch. The lyrics were muffled, sounding more like rhythmic chanting than actual words or verses. I turned to the window and looked out at the street, half expecting to see a crowd watching. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the soft amber glow of the street lamps. I realized then that the town wasn't abandoned. It was as if everyone had simply evaporated. I walked back to the booth with the steaming food and noticed a newspaper on the table. I spun around, but the diner was as empty as it had been when I walked in. The shadow and the reflection was gone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. I burst through the screen door and back onto the street, the cold air hitting my face. I decided to head back to my car and just drive until the fog cleared or I hit a highway. But as I walked, I realized the sound of the thumping wasn't coming from the diner anymore. It was coming from the center of the village square, where a large stone well stood. I tried to ignore it, but my curiosity, the same one that got me here, forced my feet forward. The square was a circle of grass surrounded by benches and a few small, silent shops. In the middle sat the well, its stones mossy and ancient, looking out of place in the 50s town. The thumping was loud here, a heavy thump, thump, like a giant heart beating underground. I walked to the edge of the well and looked down into the pitch-black darkness of the shaft. The air rising from the well didn't smell like water or earth. It smelled like dry, burnt ozone. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, but the screen was dead, completely blocked out. I reached for my professional camera hanging around my neck, hoping the battery still had life. I flipped the switch, and the small green light flickered on, the lens focusing with a whir. I held the camera up to my eye, and that's when the reality of Oakhaven finally shattered. Through my bare eyes, the square was empty, a silent void of grass and stone and fog. But when I looked through the digital viewfinder of my camera, the world was crowded. There were figures everywhere, dozens of them standing perfectly still in the square and on the sidewalks. They weren't solid. They looked like living static, vibrating and flickering like a bad TV signal. They were dressed in 1950s attire, suits, floral dresses, hats, but their faces were terrifying. Their features were blurred, as if their skin was melting or being pulled into the air above them. They were all facing the well, their heads tilted back at an impossible sharp angle. I lowered the camera, and the square was empty again. I raised it, and they were back. One figure was standing just 5 feet away from me, a man in a gray fedora. Through the lens, I could see his chest wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing, just existing. I panned the camera around, and I saw them sitting on the benches, standing in doorways. They were translucent, and I could see the buildings behind them through their flickering bodies. It was as if they were struggling to stay in this dimension, caught in a permanent glitch. The thumping from the well grew faster, matching the frantic rhythm of my own heart. I realized these were the villagers, but they weren't ghosts in any way I understood. They were echoes, or perhaps they were the original people, trapped in a loop of time. I backed away from the static man, my boots scraping loudly on the pavement of the square. I needed to get to my car and leave Oakhaven before the thumping stopped or changed. I sprinted down the main street, my camera swinging wildly against my chest as I ran. I reached my SUV, threw myself into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a sound so modern and loud it felt like a weapon in this place. I slammed the car into gear and floored it, racing back toward the road I had arrived on. I drove for 10 minutes, watching the odometer climb, but the scenery didn't change at all. I passed the Silver Spoon Diner, then the hardware store, then the toy shop with the dolls. I was driving in a straight line, but the road was looping me back to the village center. I tried again, turning onto a side street, but 3 minutes later, I was back at the well. I looked at my watch, the mechanical one I wore for hiking, and my blood turned to ice. The second hand was twitching back and forth, stuck on the 12, unable to move forward. The town wasn't just a place, it was a cage of time that had no exit. I checked the GPS again, but it was just a chaotic swirl of red and green lines now. The fog had thickened into a wall of solid white that blocked every path out of the valley. I was trapped in a 1950s nightmare that refused to return to the present day. I stopped the car in the middle of the street, the engine idling with a desperate hum. I knew I couldn't stay in the car forever. Eventually, the gas would run out in this loop. I looked toward the largest house in the village, a Victorian-style mansion at the end of the road. It was the only building that didn't look pristine. Its paint was peeling and its windows were dark. Something told me that the source of the glitch, or the way out, was inside that house. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and my camera, stepping back out into the freezing, silent air. The thumping from the well was now a deafening roar that vibrated the very marrow of my bones. As I walked toward the mansion, the static people through my camera began to turn their heads. They weren't just staring at the well anymore. They were staring at me, their blurred faces shifting. They didn't move their feet, but their bodies rotated slowly, like sunflowers following a dark sun. I reached the front door of the mansion and found it was already slightly ajar, inviting me in. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old dust and that sharp, biting scent of ozone. I followed the sound of the thumping, which was loudest directly beneath the floorboards. I found a door leading to the basement, the wood cold and damp under my trembling hand. I pulled it open, and a pulsing, soft blue light began to bleed up from the darkness below. It was the same light I had seen in the well, but here it was concentrated and blinding. I descended the wooden stairs, each step groaning under my weight like a dying animal. The basement was a massive open space that seemed much larger than the house itself. In the center of the floor, a jagged crack had opened in the concrete, glowing with blue fire. And around that crack stood the villagers, the real ones, not the static images from the street. They weren't moving, they were standing in a circle, their eyes wide open and staring at the light. They looked like they were made of wax, their skin pale and their bodies perfectly preserved. I recognized the man in the gray fedora from the square. He was standing right at the edge. I walked closer, my heart in my throat, and realized they weren't breathing, not one of them. They were suspended in a state of living death, their souls seemingly tethered to the blue glow. I held up my camera to record, but the screen was nothing but static noise and distorted lines. Suddenly, the man in the fedora turned his head, the movement slow and sickeningly mechanical. He didn't scream. Instead, a sound like 1,000 voices whispering at once came from his mouth. "The sun is coming," the voices hissed in a terrifying, discordant harmony through his lips. "You must stay with us, or you will be forgotten by the world that left us behind." He reached out a hand, his fingers elongating and turning into that same vibrating static. I realized then that if I stayed until sunrise, I would become just another flicker in the fog. I lunged backward as the man's static-filled hand swiped through the air where my chest had been. The air in the basement hissed with a sound like burning plastic as his fingers grazed my jacket. I didn't wait to see if he'd try again. I turned and scrambled back up the rotting wooden stairs. The whispering voices grew louder, a chaotic swarm of sound that seemed to crawl inside my ears. Behind me, the blue light from the crack in the floor pulsed with a violent rhythmic intensity. I burst through the basement door and back into the kitchen of the old Victorian mansion. The pristine 1950s decor was flickering now, showing glimpses of moldy wallpaper and broken glass. It was as if the reality of the village was a thin veil that was beginning to tear at the seams. I ran through the foyer, my heavy breathing the only modern sound in that suffocating, silent house. The static people were appearing in the doorways now, their blurred forms blocking my path. They didn't move to attack, but their presence felt like a physical weight against my very soul. I shouldered past a translucent woman in a floral dress, feeling a jolt of freezing electricity. I reached the front door and threw myself out onto the porch, gasping for the cold, misty air. The village square was no longer quiet. A low-frequency hum was vibrating through the ground. The sky above the fog was beginning to lighten, a pale gray signaling the approach of the dawn. I knew if I didn't find a way out before the sun hit the horizon, I'd be trapped here forever. I didn't look back at the mansion as I sprinted down the middle of the empty paved road. The Silver Spoon diner was flickering more violently now, its neon sign buzzing with dying energy. I reached the spot where I had parked my SUV, but my heart stopped when I saw the vehicle. It wasn't the shiny, modern machine I had arrived in. It looked like it had sat there for 70 years. The tires were rotted away, the paint was a sea of rust, and vines were growing through the glass. The time lock wasn't just holding the village, it was consuming everything that entered its borders. I realized then that I couldn't rely on technology or machines to get me out of this nightmare. The thumping from the well stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like deafness. Every static person in the village turned simultaneously to face the rising sun in the east. Their blurred faces seemed to stretch, their mouths opening in a silent collective plea to the light. I started running towards the eastern edge of town, where the fog wall seemed the most dense. My legs felt heavy, as if the very air was resisting my movement, trying to keep me in place. I could hear the whispering again, but this time the voices were calling out my name clearly. "Elias, stay, the light is coming, stay and be remembered," they hissed from the shadows. I covered my ears, refusing to listen to the siren song of a town that shouldn't exist. I pushed my body to its absolute limit, my lungs burning with the effort of every single breath. The edge of the village was marked by a white picket fence that looked like it went on forever. Beyond the fence was the wall of fog, pulsating with a pale golden light from the rising sun. As I reached the gate, the ground beneath my feet began to dissolve into fine gray ash. The houses behind me were collapsing into dust, their facades crumbling like burnt paper in a breeze. The illusion was failing as the sun prepared to reclaim this space for the natural, modern world. I gripped the wood of the fence, but it felt like dry sand slipping through my desperate fingers. I looked back one last time and saw the man in the gray fedora standing in the middle of the street. He wasn't static anymore. He looked solid, his eyes filled with a terrifying, ancient sadness. He raised a hand toward me, not in a threat, but as if he were reaching for a lifeline. "Don't let us go," his voice boomed, no longer a whisper, but a roar that shook the very sky. The blue light from the basement erupted upward, a pillar of energy that pierced the morning fog. I turned away from him and threw myself over the disintegrating fence into the wall of white. The sensation was like hitting a wall of ice-cold water that burned my skin like liquid nitrogen. I felt my memories of the night begin to fray, the details of the village slipping from my mind. I fought to hold on to the image of the well, the diner, and the man in the gray fedora. I fell into the fog, the world spinning into a chaotic vortex of sound, light, and absolute fear. I was falling through a void where time had no meaning and gravity was a forgotten concept. The sound of the whispering voices was replaced by a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. Images flashed before my eyes, black and white photos of families, a 1954 calendar, a blue light. Then, with the force of a car crash, I slammed onto a hard, cold, and unforgiving surface. I gasped for air, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs for the first time. I was lying on the shoulder of a paved highway, the asphalt rough against my scraped palms. I looked up and saw the sun breaking over the horizon, a normal, beautiful, golden sunrise. There was no village, no picket fence, and no pillar of blue light shooting into the sky. Behind me was nothing but miles of dense, overgrown forest and the ruins of ancient foundations. The stone remains looked centuries old, covered in moss and reclaimed by the relentless wild. I scrambled to my feet, my body aching as if I had been beaten with heavy iron bars. I checked my wrist, but my mechanical watch was gone, leaving only a pale strip of skin. My camera was still gripped in my hand, its casing cracked and its lens smudged with soot. I looked down the highway and saw a set of tire tracks leading off the road into the trees. They ended abruptly at a patch of dirt where the grass looked like it had been scorched away. I was back in my world, but the weight of Oakhaven still hung heavy in the morning air. I walked toward the tire tracks, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Near the scorched earth, I found something that made me drop to my knees in the dirt. It was a car key, modern and familiar, attached to a keychain with a small brass compass. It was the key to my SUV, the vehicle I had seen rotting and abandoned in the village loop. But there was no car here, only the empty space where it should have been parked. I realized that my vehicle hadn't returned with me. It was still trapped in that bubble of time. I stood up and started walking down the highway, hoping to find a signal or a passing car. My phone was in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen was shattered and dead. After an hour of walking, a white truck pulled over, the driver looking at me with concern. He asked if I was okay, saying I looked like I had been wandering in the woods for days. I told him my car had broken down, unable to find the words to explain the truth of the night. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, searching for any sign of the white fog. There was nothing but the green canopy of the Appalachian Mountains, silent and indifferent. The driver mentioned that this stretch of road was famous for GPS glitches and missing hikers. He laughed, calling it the Devil's Corridor, a place where the maps just didn't seem to work. I didn't laugh. I just gripped my camera tighter, praying the footage inside was still intact. I spent the next 3 days in a daze, answering questions from local police and forest rangers. They found my car's GPS signature ending right where I had left the road, but no vehicle. They treated me like a victim of a breakdown who had wandered off and gotten lost in the woods. I didn't tell them about Oakhaven, the static people, or the blue light in the basement crack. I knew they would lock me in a psychiatric ward if I spoke the words out loud to them. When I finally got home, the first thing I did was take my camera to a data recovery specialist. He told me the SD card was severely heat damaged, but he managed to save some of the files. I sat in my dark office that night, my hands trembling as I opened the video folder on my PC. Most of the files were corrupted, showing only flickering bars of color and loud, distorted static. But there was one file, recorded in the village square, that seemed to have survived the trip. I clicked play, and my own voice filled the room, sounding thin and terrified through the speakers. The footage showed the Silver Spoon Diner, looking exactly as it did when I first arrived. But there was a strange shimmering distortion in the air, like heat rising off a summer road. As I watched, I saw myself walk into the frame, but I was talking to absolutely nothing. I was gesturing toward a table as if someone was sitting there, but the chair was empty. The camera panned across the street, showing only the abandoned modern ruins I saw at the end. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath hitching as I noticed something in the background. In the corner of the screen, near the village well, a faint figure was beginning to materialize. It wasn't a person, but a shape made of that same vibrating digital static I had seen. As the footage played, the shape grew clearer, taking on the form of a man in a gray fedora. He was looking directly at the camera, his eyes two dark pits in a face of white noise. I paused the video and zoomed in, my heart stopping as I saw what he was holding. It was a small, rectangular object that looked exactly like a modern smartphone from our era. He wasn't from the past. He was someone like me, trapped in a loop that spanned decades. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized the true nature of the Village of the Fog. It wasn't just a place that vanished. It was a collection point for those lost in time's cracks. Every few decades, the door opens and it takes someone else to keep the village alive. I looked at my own hands, half expecting to see them start to flicker and turn into static. I began to search online for any mention of Oakhaven or missing persons in that specific region. I found a forum post from 2005 about a hiker who claimed he saw a ghost town in the fog. He had never been seen again after posting his coordinates, which matched mine exactly. I knew then that I hadn't truly escaped Oakhaven. A part of me was still there. I scrolled through pages of missing persons reports, going back as far as the records allowed. I found a scan of a newspaper from November 1954 detailing a mass disappearance in the valley. 32 people had vanished in a single night, leaving their homes and belongings behind. The headline read, "The fog of Oakhaven claims the innocent. Search parties find only silence." I stared at the grainy photos of the missing, my eyes searching for a face I recognized. And then, on the second page, I found the flyer that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a missing persons notice for a young man named Arthur Vance, aged 26. The face in the photo was identical to the man in the gray fedora I saw in the basement. He had been a local school teacher who disappeared while walking home during a heavy mist. But there was a second photo on the flyer, showing Arthur's younger brother who also vanished. The brother's name was listed as Elias, the same name as mine, a name I thought was unique. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the connection wasn't a coincidence. The village didn't just take people, it chose them based on some twisted ancestral tie. I was the descendant of the people who stayed, and the village had been calling me home. The thumping I heard in my head wasn't a sound, it was a heartbeat, and it was mine. I realized that I hadn't just found a story. I had walked into my own pre-written destiny.